cultural differences, often overlooked in these scenarios. And honestly, at certain times I've sat through some of these panels and they've sort of glossed over the cultural perspective, right? And not necessarily talking about real life example sort of things. So I was fine with this question coming in here. So we talked about some real specific examples of how this should be incorporated into overall strategy. And despite just saying, yes, culture is different, what does that mean? Where have you seen it work? Where have you seen it have it? How can companies sort of address the whole cultural aspect generally?
So it's a really important point. I think, as you said, it often isn't part of the business evaluation framework that you would use. Most companies are generally good at thinking about the direct variables around market size and potential and competitive dynamics and things like that, but often under-resourced attention to how are they going to build the elements of their culture and the other intangibles that are making their business succeed here abroad. So I'll give you an example of a company that I think has done it well. And I think a lot of the points we've just hit already naturally in talking about some of the other elements of this. But one of the companies we're involved with is Twilio. When Twilio went to establish an international office in London, they sent an exec there first just to hang out there and spend some time there kind of understanding the different dynamic and how the various elements of their developer evangelism and their marketing were going to be applicable to Europe, to the United Kingdom, to that continent as well. And then they make sure that lots of the execs from the US spend time there, that it's not seen as this distant wing of the company, but that there's a constant flow of folks coming through there to be able to make them feel part of the operations of the company. And Jeff spent some time out there, as well as the other key execs at the same time. And then they also apply a lot of their same rigor around how they think about developer marketing and the different touch points that they have with developers in the same way in Europe, and ensure that same quality of interactions, that they're having the same level of engagement with various developers, that the same up the funnel metrics that you might think of from a marketing context, they're measuring that same stuff at the same time to be able to tell, is this being effective? And I think through a mix of finding those early employees that kind of had elements of the Twilio culture, but applied, to within London and within that context, which is a hard assessment to do and really just took on the ground work, they've been able to get it right. If they hadn't done that up front, who knows? I mean, it may not have felt, kind of Twilio-esque in the way they established it. So that's one example. It's hard to give a blueprint. I mean, it just takes thought and work and kind of examining the situation on the ground before you take that step. I rambled on too long, so I shut them up.
And it's hard too. I mean, I think just to layer on top of it, I touched on Atlassian, which is a Sydney-founded company. They now have offices in Amsterdam, San Francisco, Sydney, and a bunch of other locations. But every employee at the company spends 2 weeks a year in Sydney, and it is absolutely not the most cost-efficient thing to do. But they feel like it's important from a culture perspective, right? That everyone understands how the business is operating. They feel like they're a part of the overall organization. And I think to Ethan's point, it's just critical that you embrace that, and then you understand that the cultures are different in the other offices in which you're operating. And just facilitating that discussion and making it feel like it's part of one team is really hard and really tricky to do, but I do think it helps you, overcome a lot of those cultural barriers.
That's great. We're doing a very effective job because we're actually ahead of schedule, so I'm going to throw in a wild card here. And so I'll speak slowly so you guys have a chance to think about it before you answer. Does international matter, right? So at a certain point of liquidity, right? So say a company is going to go public, right? And again, I know it depends on the company, it depends on the sector, it depends on those sorts of things, but if they're planning on going public, is it important whatsoever to have an international footprint? And conversely, let's say they get acquired, right? Is it important, is it seen as a positive that they have a footprint that's outside the United States, or does it really matter?
I think it's absolutely critical, and the reason for that is most companies are international. So I highlighted earlier the exact Target example where literally they had a customer that was a huge customer of theirs, but they weren't ready to renew unless the company itself had presence in international offices. And so I think that's just becoming more and more common. That being said, I don't think you have to go international that early. As we keep, it bears repeating that, make sure it works. So, you can be a very large company before you do it, but I think it's absolutely important just because it's an international world. Most companies that you'll be selling to have international offices, and so you need the presence. So as far as the public markets, it's just I see it as it's another market in terms of adding revenue. So you probably still could build a giant business in the US that investors would value. But I just think it's for your customers, you have to be international.
I'm going to take maybe a slightly different vantage point on the question, just to inject some controversy here. But I would say not necessarily is it necessary for you to establish international offices. And I think I'm taking this from sort of the consumer world, where often you can localize, you can watch metrics, you can have a truly global audience without having an office outside of San Francisco or outside of really anywhere in the world. I'm on the board of a company, Twitch, that has the largest live streaming network anywhere, and they've got 55 people in San Francisco, but their audience is truly global. It's 40% US, 40% Europe, 20% Asia, and they don't need people on the ground to be able to do that. In fact, they don't even need equipment in those other locations because they're able to rely on partners to do that. So I think the first part of the question is absolutely important to think about an international audience. It's not necessarily imperative that you have folks around the world.
Yeah, I think they made a good point. I think what the difference there is, if it's consumer facing, your strategy can work. If you're client facing, where customers, you're doing high-end enterprise sales, which, we all would love it to be a telesales world, but there at the high end, there's still some face-to-face interaction, and if there's any implementation, I think that's the point when you start to have presence overseas, just because they want someone in the local culture who understands their business. And then there's the big question, if you open an office in London, how can they service Spain? And so those are challenges, because it's, very different. So figuring that out, how far do you expand into a certain continent, how does that work? That's a challenge, but I think for consumer, it's okay to be in one location, because most of the time you don't have to interact face-to-face, but for high-end enterprise, you potentially do.
No, I would agree, but I think, as you look at the examples, I think that no matter what, you need to be able to answer the question when somebody asks, whether it's an acquirer or a public investor, of what are you doing internationally? You may not have to be there, but you have to have an answer of how are you going to address the rest of the world, which is not an insignificant amount of people and customers. And so if you can't do that, then so you need to have a plan even if you haven't implemented it.
Great point. Okay. All right, last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience here. So this is really sort of meant to be the the catch-all, right? But sort of summarization, if you will. Maybe we can just run down the line, starting with Stacey. So, can you provide some advice to entrepreneurs who are reaching out to you with eyes on international expansion, do's and don'ts? I know we've talked about a number of these things, but so perhaps the question is maybe more so, in summary, or if anything earth-shattering you've thought of that you haven't shared yet.
I think my first question would be, why are you going international? I think depending on the stage of the company, if it's super late stage, then sure, that's been the reason for some of our investments in companies, is to help them do that. But if you're early, it'd make me wonder, is it not selling in the US? So I think that's the big kind of question of just, are you trying to go somewhere else because you think it'll sell? I don't know. So I like, to the point, I know we've kind of beaten it to death, but see it working here first. And I don't know, maybe you guys can speak better to the consumer side. I focus mostly on the enterprise. So I know in consumer sometimes it's just, certain things take off in different countries, but for enterprise, you'd like to see it working here first. And typically the US customers sometimes, at least on the marketing side, tend to be a little bit more advanced in terms of trying new marketing technology, so often it does take off here first. But that's my one comment.
Yeah, I think the first question I would ask is, have you hired Ben and the DLA team to help you expand overseas, and have you thought this through? And after they assured me of that they negotiated a good rate, I would, I'd come back and ask them how much they've tested it. It goes back a little bit to the measurability, and whether you're a software company distributing over the internet or you're selling, you're targeting consumers, you do have this ability to, what I would say, test, measure, and repeat constantly. So try something in a new geography, localize your website, change your pricing, actually convert it from US dollars to euros and see what your conversion looks like. Does it do better? once you go into local currency. But come back with some of that data first. And I do think that's the beauty of the internet right now, is that you're afforded the ability to go out and absolutely test everything before you make decisions. And I think companies, sometimes try to run before they walk, and you don't have to right now. You really have the ability to take a step back, try different things out, and kind of see the results of these before you're doing it. So that's kind of my biggest advice. And what I also would say is that when I love this topic, sometimes often I get frustrated in Silicon Valley because I think companies can't think outside of a 6-mile radius. They think the world starts with Apple, goes to Facebook, ends with Google. And there's a lot of customers out there, and there's a lot of people you can be selling your products to. So I do kind of applaud you guys for coming and making this an interesting topic, because the best companies in the world truly do think global, and I think you have to do that earlier than ever with how small the internet is making the world from a figure of speech.
Yeah, I'll actually take a little bit of a contrary opinion to that, is that I do think that it is important, you have to think about it, but I also think that a lot of companies get ahead of themselves and think, well, geez, everyone's going international, so therefore I need to. But it's got to be right for you in terms of what you're doing, your product. You talk about that some things lend themselves easier earlier on, some things don't. Are there customers that are going to pull you there, or are you just going there because your competitor is? So you need to think through the strategy, and I think part of it is a non-trivial exercise to do some of these things. And being in a startup, even at 30 or 40, 50 million, is still a pretty challenging business to be in. And do you really want to take on the headache of now doing that in multiple locations with culture and everything else we've talked about? So I do think it's something you need to always be planning ahead for. You need to be thinking about, you need to be trying things in different markets. But I think this kind of rush to judgment of, we're at 1 million in sales, let's go international, that may or may not be the right decision. And definitely, joking aside, I would definitely always encourage people to understand that you don't know what you don't know, and talk to everybody, the people, other senior executives, advisors, anyone you can, because you never know what's going to go on in some of these foreign markets.
So I'll try to thread the needle between those last two responses. The one thing I would always ask before you go international is there a way you can go international without really going international first? And so think about that for a second. What can you do to fake it and collect some data from either an experiment, outsource the whole project at first? That's possible in some industries. In consumer, hire a translator and put up a landing page and see if the value proposition works and how it works before you do any of the other things. Because all joking aside, Ben's team's gonna cost you, and that's just the first expense you're gonna pay for international expansion. I'm not gonna run down the list, but it's not. It's a bet to be considered measurably, and I think Ryan hit this point, but you don't have to take that bet without a lot of data and a lot of knowledge about whether it's going to work first. It's actually the same approach to building a startup in a lean way to begin with. Build as little as you can, experiment and collect as much data as possible with as little as you possibly have to build, and then riff off of that. And I think when you're talking about expanding internationally, there's going to be some things you get wrong and that you're going to have to do in a different way. And so identifying those things early and with as little cost into it as possible really can't be, you can't overstate the importance of that.
Makes sense, thanks for the plugs and the jabs. Okay, so let's go ahead and open it up. I'll just, obviously we're not going to walk the microphone around, but are there any particular questions? Is that a hand back here?
Around common resources. When you go to international, local resources you tap into, that you should explore. For every company, it's a little different, but are there a set of common resources that you should definitely evaluate for lawyers or other connectors?
So we try to understand the question. Are there a set of resources in country?
Yeah, if you, in general, when you're going international, there's space issues, real estate, law, regulation, accounting. In general, are there a set of different things we should explore to try to set up an office?
So the question is sort of where to go to find those resources, or how to explore those resources. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, when our companies are exploring it, obviously they have the benefit of an investor and a portfolio. So what we do is really tap into our third-party resources. It is the accounting firms, it's the legal firms, and just trying to set up as many meetings as possible for them to talk to people. If we have other companies that have done it, We try to set them up with meetings there so they can walk them through their experience, the ins and outs, the goods and bads. So to the extent to which you're not dealing with investors or a lot of third-party resources, it truly is, as Ethan said, just getting out and talking to as many people as possible that have been there and done that. The other thing one of my companies does is before they make any of those decisions, they try to experiment in a local market by doing some sort of meetup or some kind of drink event and seeing who shows up actually. And you get to talk to a lot of people there, and if people aren't showing up, it tends to be a bad sign that no one really cares about your product or brand. But it's an easy way for them, and a very cost-efficient way for them to just talk about what's happening in these local markets. So at the end of the day, just be as resourceful as possible and just try to get access to as many folks who have been there.